All right. We're back. The boys are back. It's been a hot minute since we did one of these. And you guys have done some research, peer reviewed paper. Let's talk about it. Who wants to take this first? Eric or Kedric?
Hey, this is part of Dr. Kwan's thesis, so I'm going to let him take lead.
Okay. Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So this paper, all right, that was recently published. As part of my PhD. So it's one of the two surveys that we did. So a little bit of a background on kind of like my PhD process. In I need to at least get two papers published as part of my PhD. So this is my second paper out of potentially 4 or 5 chapters, right? Sorry, 4 or 5 papers, right? So you should expect at least a minimum of two more publications within the next year. Fingers crossed, depending on how long the publication process takes. From my team, right? So my team includes Eric and some of the other co-authors, like Andrew King and some other of our staff. So this is the second paper, and it is kind of like a survey paper, right? So if you look at the title, right, the title basically states exploratory analysis. So that is actually quite crucial, right? Because I think when people read scientific papers, they're like, oh, this is a scientific paper, peer reviewed, right? Therefore, it is causal and deterministic. So X, if there's X, it equals Y. So it's not actually like that. I think that when it comes to writing papers, there are sort of like different levels. And just before, getting everybody too bogged down in the nitty gritty of things, essentially what we did, exploratory analysis means that we didn't state our hypothesis prior, right, in terms of pre-registration. So when it comes to publishing papers, right, there's something called pre-registration where you just like register this is what I'm going to do, these are my methods, this is my hypothesis. So what that
Kedric, I
is
love you, but I don't think you need to explain pre-registration or pre-hypothesis. Why don't we say, hey, this is what I did, and here's the main stuff.
You didn't call your shot like Babe Ruth. Okay, you took. That's what you.
Cool. Yeah. So essentially, what we did was we surveyed lifters at Worlds, right? Across two Worlds. First Worlds we did was in 2019 in Sweden, right? And then COVID hit, right? And then we continued the next survey in South Africa. So there was essentially two cohorts. We made sure that there was no crossover. So whoever we surveyed at Worlds in Sweden, we did not do it again, right? Because if not, they're basically doubling up on the same person. And we use sort of like a recovery questionnaire, right? It's called SRSS, short recovery and stress scale. Basically, you have 8 questions, and it measures certain sort of like measures, right? Such as like mental capacity, physical capacity, negative emotional state, and you rate it on a scale of sort of like 1 to 6, if I'm not mistaken, right? Basically, does it apply or does it not apply, right? So it rates in that sense. So what we did was we basically got 3 time points. And essentially what I wanted to do was kind of like a follow-up after my first survey, where the first survey that was published, that survey was done in 2018 in Calgary, where we just used a general survey of what world-class powerlifters utilize for weight cutting. But what I wanted to do was to dive a little bit deeper, where we look at the changes in like essentially what we can call subjective feedback, like how you feel during the cutting process across a duration of time. So we did one roughly 5 to 6 days out, right? Before they start their sort of like their cut, right? And then we did one 2 days before their weigh-ins, and then we did another survey right after their weigh-ins. So we have 3 different time points, and what we were trying to see was we're trying to look at the difference in their sort of like subjective state across the time as they go through the cutting process, essentially trying to get a clearer picture of what the lifter is feeling throughout the entire cutting process. So that is kind of like what we did in our paper, right? I guess that is a pretty decent introduction that we can start with.
Interesting. Now this is going to be a lot of the feedback is making. I feel pretty shitty on a scale of. But on the level of 1 to 10, how shitty is basically what you want to know. And looking at it when I was reading is possible impact on performance psychologically, and then how does that actually tie off physiologically, not to get too deep in the weeds, and I'll throw it back to you guys, obviously, but there have been studies where there are Olympic athletes in Russia, and they were tying in, if you picture a freaking lemon, you picture this lemon, you can see every contour, and I put a knife in that lemon and take a slice into that. What is happening to your mouth right now? And the people are literally salivating. There's a physical reaction to that mental imagery. So there's ties there. How you think you feel, how you feel, and how you're going to perform, etc. And this is very pertinent to athletes. So you got to be careful. If you start putting yourself under duress, more than just the actual weight training itself, how is that going to impact your overall performance? And it's interesting, these kind of conversations of overall, everybody cuts. Another thing the paper said, it looked like people cut in all over the place at all different levels. So this is very pertinent to a majority of the lifters right now. So anyways, you don't want to tank yourself. What did you guys find out? And I remember those 2 worlds fondly. I love what we're talking about, 2021, 2022 worlds.
Let me give you just a little bit of interesting background on, what we describe as scales or psychometrics, or when Kedric says a validated scale. And to your point, Ryan, when we're not looking at a measure of physiology, I think a lot of the times, especially more objectively minded individuals, they tend to maybe dismiss or see it as something as less useful. But then we all ubiquitously use RPE in powerlifting, and we're comfortable with that. But that took some time. I think the reason why our very data-centric, quantitative minds, objective, which is great for a closed sport like powerlifting, where your training almost is exactly the same as the competition, and we're changing variables like macros, sets, reps, and we want these predictable outcomes. That's all great and fine. But I think it's really important to understand that it's really challenging to measure something that is a really good proxy for how well you're going to do in an actual competition. And to date, even though we've got all the advanced AI and all these cool things, when you look at studies which try to capture a more holistic perspective on predicting, say, internal load, which is basically, or rather predicting external load and performance or fatigue, whether you're doing it retrospectively or prospectively, trying to figure out what is going to predict someone's performance or overtraining or burnout, or what is currently most reflective of, say, the external load, like we were to do sets times reps times load, or some type of metric that, and cyclists or swimmers or whatever represents their training. To date, still the best things that we have are validated questionnaires. And I think that's a really important distinction. So when we say validation in research, what we mean is that studies have been done to specifically look at, does it represent something? Mm-hmm. And then there's actually a statistical guideline for the degree to which it does represent it. And then there are certain thresholds. There's many simple and more complex ways to do it. But the simple representation is like, if we wanted to say, hey, if I gave you a questionnaire called the SRSS, which is the one that we used, does that seem to line up with other variables of interest that we care about, that we can measure in a different way? And if there has a reasonably reliable, it's not the same as validation, means we get the same scores and it represents the same output that we're trying to represent on a regular basis, then we could say, okay, it's reliable. And then the validity of it is it actually representing the thing we care about? So that validity and reliability is essentially best encapsulated by thinking of, okay, if let's say the target, and I'll use a different example, is your true body fat percentage, how much fat mass is on your body. The only way for us to actually know that would be to dissect you and weigh your fat mass. Unfortunately, you then can't tell the person their body fat percentage after it because they are dead. But they are shredded at that point because you
fucking it, right so they are, buddy.
They died looking good.
Literally, the good play on words. Whoa, you're hot right now. Keep going.
I've shredded them, and now they are shredded. So anyway, validity is, okay, does this DEXA scan, does this skin fold caliper, does this bioelectrical impedance, does the dunk tank, is it hitting the same target? And then reliability is the cluster of those arrows. In an ideal situation, you have something that is clustering very close to the target, but you can have something that's systematically off, but it's reliably off. And sometimes that can still be useful. So for example, if people have a similar diet all the time and they're tracking their macros and they don't have a lot of variability in their diet, they may not actually be eating 2,500 calories. In fact, they're probably not. But if they're typically eating the same foods from the same places, then the inherent variability in labeling, food weights, water concentration, and energy density, if they have a relatively repeatable environment, okay, they're actually eating 2,700, but it doesn't matter because as a practitioner, I might still drop their calories or increase their calories based upon body weight change. So all of that is to say that the SRSS is a validated questionnaire that has been shown to represent a lot of different outcomes within sports science broadly. So it's not just, Kedric went out to the world and said, so how do you feel, bro? Like that cut must have been rough. And then we wrote it up. It does have various relationships in the literature, and it's pretty well established as a useful tool. And it's been used in combat sport, also in the same type of research. So anyway, all that is to say, just because sometimes I think when you think sports science, people want, I want timing gates, I want DEXA, I want MRI, and that stuff's all great. But it doesn't necessarily capture the holistic overall experience that might indicate total fatigue or performance, because how someone does on game day is a combination of a lot of different physiological and psychological factors, to your point.
I mean, yeah, we look at Sheffield when Russ came in saying, I'm cooked. Lots of different people have come in saying, I'm cooked. So yeah, where do we pick up? What did you guys find when you started looking over what you did and rolling these out, Kedric?
So I think the interesting thing I think the major finding, right? So we can kind of like go through the major finding first, and then we can go to other interesting facts. So what we actually looked at was we basically found that people actually felt a little bit worse, right? With the scores on certain measures, right? Actually increased when the amount of weight they lost increased. So the statistical method we use isn't saying that, oh, because you lost weight, this happened. What we try to do, what we actually use a model that basically tells that for every kilo loss, right? What are the odds of this particular state, right? For example, let's just say negative emotional stress. What are the odds of negative emotional stress going up for every kilo loss? So we are doing it in that fashion. We're not just saying, oh, because you lose weight, this is what happens, right? And using odds is essentially saying, it's kind of like trying to look at it from a more like probabilistically probable rather than saying causal, right? So if you lose X amount of weight, it's more probable by this % that you'll feel this way. So it's not saying that, oh, because you lose it, you are feeling like that, right? And the reason why we also use that is because the scale in general, the model reflects the scale better, because essentially we use like very like descriptive things like, oh, is it applicable, fully applicable, not applicable? And for someone like myself, I might assess fully applicable very different from how Eric, Ryan, or Rory, how we assess it, right? So it's not like it's not actually saying like on 0 to 6 is actually each point is actually 1 point more than the other, right? So it's more of it's a better measure of something that sort of like a quantitative way to measure your qualitative state, right? Just to put this, it's a better way to measure your fields, essentially. So yeah, we look at it from that perspective. And I think the big thing we found was that on average, participants decreased their body weight by 0.39 kilograms between day 7 and day 2. We use day 7 basically before they started their weight cut. So essentially, when we look right before they start their weight cut to day 2, meaning 2 days out, they lost 0.39, which is actually very small. And then from day 2 to day 0, meaning from the midpoint, I mean, I wouldn't say the midpoint, maybe 70% true to the weigh-ins, they lost 1.44 kilograms, so a bigger increase. So if you can think about it, it's almost 3 times the increase of body weight within like maybe 3 times shorter of the time frame. So that was
much more
the major
aggressive
finding. Yeah. And if you think about it, it might be much more aggressive, but it could also be just the cut finally taking its effect. Because if you look at typical methods of cutting, like gut cutting, people usually employ it for 3 to 4 days, and they start losing weight like midway through, right? On the first day of an intervention, you don't usually lose weight, right? On the water sort of fluid manipulation, you only lose weight at the night before, right? When you are like reducing your water or you're fasting, right? So it could just be one. So this is the thing with this surveys, we cannot tell because I didn't actually go in depth. I didn't do an in-depth interview with each participant on how they executed the cut, right? So that is a limitation that we stated in a paper. I didn't ask everybody write your weight cutting process down in detail. But so we can just assume one, it could be possible that somebody might not be seeing their weight go down and they might do something aggressive in the last 2 days, or it could just be the natural state of things where their weight would just naturally fall off during the last 2 days. I think that if we were to kind of like a way that we could probably sort of like tease that out better is that if we actually did this survey 5 times and we look at day 2, your weight is still high, and then the day before it dropped exponentially, then you could say that, okay, one day out, they started doing something more aggressive. But due to the constraints of, just being there, I actually administered the survey in person because I wanted to clarify if they are mistaken about stuff. I also wanted to remind them, if you're filling this same survey, don't just like fill it up just because you need to fill a survey, take this, would you like this to fill up this survey to get a 10% discount on the next product, and everybody just put 5 on everything. I don't want that to happen. So because of logistical constraints, I decided that these 3 time points was better. But if we were to say, if we actually surveyed them like 5 times, we could probably get better data points or to actually explain why that's the case. But yeah, so majority of the weight was lost during that last 2 days. And the big thing was the association between good lift points and competition, and the magnitude of weight change was high, right? So between what we said that essentially people with higher good lift points, right, tend to cut more weight, which is kind of like also in line with our previous surveys. And after that, we further did.
I got one question. Sorry, I'll pause you right there. I got one question. I got a question first. Let me also say, because guys, remember, every now and then we got to check up on Rory on these science episodes. This is my level. This is my level. I'm with you, but please check in on every now and then. Check in on Rory. You okay, buddy? You want me to explain anything?
I'm keeping up so far.
Okay. Okay. You let me know. So
we need to bring it down to Rory's level,
guys. He's not going to say anything.
I'm representing the audience here, so if I don't understand, they won't understand.
Okay. Good. But so essentially, in terms of the GL points in the body weight cuts, you're saying people who would cut more had higher GL points based off of this. Does that mean? Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
In a sense, yes, but we cannot draw causal relationships because obviously GL points is also linked to your body weight, so there might be reverse causation as well, right? Because obviously if your body weight goes down, your GL point goes up. So I can't say which direction is actually pointing towards, which is actually very important because I don't want people to think that advanced lifters necessarily cut more. There might be advanced lifters like that, but their relationships are also dependent on one another.
Yeah, you're not saying Ryan, that because they've cut more, they're getting higher GL points, or vice versa. You're saying that they tend to cut more and they tend to have higher good lift points. Relationship TBD.
Because there might also be the pause. Sorry, Eric, do you want to go?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Something quite similar.
I just want to say that it probably just says that, at least they perform decent, because if you cut a lot and you perform absolutely trash, your GL points would be low. Or if you cut and you bomb out, you have 0 GL points. And in our survey, there was actually one participant where we have to exclude because the participant actually did day 7, day 2, but did not weigh in, did not make weight, right? So we had to exclude that participant. So obviously that participant had 0 GL points, right? So that's another example.
Yeah.
Well, it is so obviously they performed. Go ahead, Eric. Hop in
real quick though, Ryan, because I think we glossed over, and I think Rory made a really important distinction. But the implications of him noticing, hey, this thing happened and this thing happened, doesn't necessarily mean that thing caused that thing to happen. Is something we should take a step back in, because this is probably maybe one of the top reasons people will misinterpret science. And when you'll see it, like the telephone game of researchers published a study, it gets grabbed by influencer or media, it gets communicated, and it's totally misunderstood, is specifically due to this reality. only certain studies are able to isolate a cause and an effect. And even when they do, often in our field, the sample size is small enough that we need to actually replicate it a few times to be sure that that was the causal factor, not some extraneous variable that even though we controlled for it in the study. So you've probably heard of an RCT, a randomized controlled trial. As an example, blood pressure medication. We give a bunch of people an actual blood pressure med, a bunch of people a pill that it has nothing in it. It's an inert substance, and a bunch of other people nothing. And then we look at the effect of just taking the pill, just taking the pill that has nothing in it, or just typical variation. And only when you see meaningfully greater changes in the group that actually took the pill compared to the placebo in the other group, and everything else was the same because we randomly sampled those participants. We randomly assigned them to those 3 different conditions. And also we blinded the participants. They don't know which one they got. And we blinded the researchers. So we don't know which one they got. Can we truly say there was causation? And if we had 10 people and we put 4 in one group, 3 in the other, 3 in the other, there's no way to know for sure that there wasn't some other environmental condition that could have, by chance, impacted one group versus another. So like the 3 people that we put in the group that took the blood pressure medication also happened to live newly in a new walkable area and got more physical activity. And that's why the blood pressure dropped, right? So when we do a survey like this, and when we do any type of what's called cross-sectional investigation, that means we're measuring at one time point, we just know whether those things occurred together. So another sports science example where this is often misunderstood is that if you were to test a bunch of people who had a hamstring tear 1 year ago, you would see that maybe their left hamstring was weaker than their right by 10 or 15% or more. And if you just kind of looked at the abstract or took a high level thing, like, oh, well, their hamstring being weaker probably caused that injury. And it's like, well, or was their hamstring weaker because they had the injury and it was currently present and still impacting them, or the detraining effect was persisting, right? Another thing, like in nutrition research, a great example would be, hey, vegetarians tend to live longer than other people. But then we start to control for vegetable intake, smoking, physical activity, and all these other variables that might co-vary with being a vegetarian, because they're generally more health conscious people, generally more physically active, typically in a higher socioeconomic status. Now we start to see that when we control for all those facts, it's not that being a vegetarian necessarily makes you more healthy, it's that eating more vegetables does. So it's not the exclusion of animal products, except unless we're talking like processed red meat, which is a whole other discussion. So those relationships are really important to understand. So when we say, hey, these folks with higher GL points also cut more, what we could be seeing is a number of different reasons for that. For example, survivorship bias. If you want to compete at the highest level in the sport and you really, really suffer every time you cut weight, you're going to be at a disadvantage compared to other people. So whatever collection of things that result in someone being more robust to maintaining strength when dropping a fair amount of weight that allows them to perform, whether that is resilience to heat exposure, resilience to dehydration, mental fortitude, emotional ability to regulate their anxiety, other factors related to that, that will be more present among top performers in the sport. And as our sport grows, we're going to see more and more people getting crowded out from being in the top ranks if they don't have some of these natural characteristics. Like I remember watching as a kid the Olympics, and the commentators were like, it's really interesting how swimming makes you get these broader lats and longer limbs. And I was like, oh, cool. And like, then now I look back on that, I'm like, or the only body type that can compete at the Olympic Games level in swimming to even qualify and get a sniff at a chance of placing 10th, let alone getting a podium spot, are people built like this because they can move through the water faster. And we're starting to see more and more and more of that anytime a sport gets more developed. And I think that's just something for us always to remember.
Are you telling me if I start playing basketball right now, I won't grow over 6 feet tall? Because that was what I was hoping. I was all right.
Perfect. I love that you're joking, Ryan, but that's the exact type of thinking you need to have. Right. Like sometimes it's a lot more intuitive. Other times it's not. Like, and we think that the sport is doing something like, oh, because what we don't want is people to read the study and go, well, I need to cut more if I need to be better. Like, man, I'm an 83 and I'm totaling 700. If I was a 59, I'd be crushing it. And they're gonna probably not be able to total that same total if they drop 20 kilos, right? So
I was gonna say they might not total at all after dropping 20 kilos.
Well, someone didn't in the study, which is important. Which is important too. If you guys actually had someone bomb, or not bomb, didn't even make it, right? Did they not even make weight? So there you go. All right, let's talk about some more stuff that you guys found there, Kedric.
But I think, like I said, I cannot put a really strong causal claim. But what we can actually see is that if you are trying to factor performance, there's at least a soft case to be made that those people that cut weight did perform decently, because when we look at the medals, 7 participants that if we look at the medals and look at the GLP points, so we look at 100, and the medalists they had 104.5, right, GLP points, whereas non-medalists is 95.4, right? So that could also be a case that, okay, cool, relative to the people in their weight class, the people actually perform better, because obviously when you look at medals, there's objective placing 1, 2, 3, right? Not just in a cohort. And what we also looked at was the average placing for all participants to show that they're at least quite elite. So the average placing was 7.5, right, out of 17.1 total places, right? So basically saying that it is slightly more than the middle, right? So that actually shows that the people that we survey are at least slightly better than the average in a cohort that's already elite, right? So because naturally we have, I remember Worlds in Malta where you have like 500 over people, right? So and some of them just literally have basically when they have a qualifier, lifted something that even I can lift, and they decide to go on a holiday because it's Malta, but what we're trying to say is that based on this sort of like demographic data, right, the lifters that we surveyed was actually quite high level and quite elite in the entire population. So that was actually kind of like certain breakdown to kind of say, okay, cool, it applies to this set of population for a specific reason, which also is very much aligned with our previous survey data as well. And another interesting thing that we found was that we looked at sort of like sex differences between males and females. So when we look at that, we actually saw that there's certain sort of like characteristics that we measure. The most prominent one, which we will probably dive into a little bit more, that women, female lifters, they tend to undergo higher negative emotional state, right? When they're cutting from day 2 to day 0, and that was not present in male lifters. And this is also very much in line with combat sport literature, where females tend to actually feel a greater negative impact during cutting, right? So that is another interesting finding that we can also potentially dive into. So there are multiple angles that we can go from here. Obviously, I'm trying to just recall the main things that stuck out to me on top of my head. I being the author of this paper, and after reading it multiple times during my thesis and publication, I have not read it since my last revision. So if I have not read the entire paper in depth. Obviously, I did do a refresher before our podcast. But
Kedric paid his reformance coaches to do his thesis for him, and that's fine.
Quick question. Was one of the things, though, I know when women are going through their period, it becomes a lot harder. You read that often sometimes in recaps where it's like, ended up getting my period and try to cut when that's happening. It's incredibly more difficult, and men have no idea like how much more. I know that's not what your paper was diving into, but there are other variables, obviously. So then it becomes, it could be a whole lot more stressful, right? Did you guys account for that? Are those type of questions obviously asked in this, or?
Yeah, so I accounted for all of that to make sure that they are not within that, or usually they whether they're on some kind of birth control or something like that, just to make sure that doesn't sort of like murky, make the data murkier, right? So those are things we usually ask. Essentially, what we do is I have like a question, right? Oh, this is your age, this is your whatever, your weight class, right? And then I ask these questions, right? But usually, just to make sure that the data the data set is actually consistent across the board, because obviously we're looking at males and females, right? So those that does not fit, we would either, most likely we remove the data points. But in this case, I just said like, okay, cool. If you are on your period, we just won't ask you to do it, because
Yep.
you have to you have to come
it was
see
what we
me
call
three
an
times.
exclusion criteria.
Oh, gotcha.
Right. So if someone was currently undergoing their menstrual cycle and potentially experiencing PMS symptoms, then they would not be included in the study. So that is something that wasn't explored. And I think importantly, Ryan, even if it was, and we did see, we had that, we couldn't necessarily pin down this apparent sex difference to that cause. So it's really also important to know that it's natural for us to try to look for explanations for findings, but unless we truly measured that variable and are able to isolate it, it's going to remain speculative. And I think I brought this up when we had the crossover with Ben, Presser Powerlifting. I brought up how if you look at the literature on women and men looking at quote unquote sex differences, you will see that they gain a similar relative proportion of muscle mass from wherever they start on average. So even if someone gains 20 pounds or 10 kilograms as a female, and it's 20, 30% more than that for a male, it's actually relative to their starting point. They might both have increased their muscle mass 20%. And the interesting thing was that that's true for lower body strength, but not due to upper body strength. And you might have some sports scientists who mechanistically theorize that, oh, this has something to do with like androgen receptor density in the upper body. And it's like, or there's still a, pretty substantial difference in the sport participation of men and women. And even in men and women who do participate in sports, the S&C exposure and the frequency at which men are doing American football in these predominantly North American studies is much higher. So when we assess quote unquote untrained male and female participants, if one played 4 years of high school football and one didn't play sports at all, and another played 4 years of volleyball, and they did so years ago when S&C was even less common and sport participation was even lower, the quote unquote untrained training age could be a systematic difference. It's actually due to societal differences, not any type of true biological difference. So that's one really interesting thing to point out. It could be related to dietary habits that are not necessarily related to female hormones or differences in chromosomes. It could be related to the higher proportion of disordered eating patterns, so that anytime there is a manipulation of nutrition, it could call on prior related stress or experiences that may be unrelated to the fact that, someone was born biologically as a female or male. So I think it's important to point out at that distinction. It probably, we know it wasn't related to PMS symptoms in this, but what actually caused that difference is very difficult for us to tease out. And I want to point out one other thing, and then I'm going to kick it back to Kedric or see if you guys have any questions. Kedric mentioned that he could build a causal case for that, the fact that cutting more did actually help their performance. And I think sometimes we think of causation in very, very limited terms. So if I did this, it immediately caused that. Like I pushed on the gas and the car went. But in reality, when we're talking about complex systems, causation also includes things that contribute to an outcome, but aren't necessarily required. So when we talk about like the epistemology and philosophy of science, fancy words, it means necessary versus sufficient conditions. So for example, the car will not go if I don't press on the gas pedal, right? That is a necessary condition to get it to go forward unless someone hits me from behind, right? But also another necessary condition is I have to have enough gas in the gas tank and the engine has to be on, right? But now if you ask me, well, what contributes to the speed of the car? I could say, well, it is causal that I have to push on the accelerator. But if you go, well, if the handbrake's on, you'll still go some speed. And I go, well, okay, so it's to have a faster speed, it is influenced by, it is a, sufficient influence on it, but it's not a necessary thing. I can still get the car to go some speed with the handbrake on. And to make this a little more tangible for like powerlifting, think about muscle size, right? There's a big debate about whether or not having bigger muscles actually makes you stronger. And people in the real world go like, how could there possibly be a debate? But here's something crazy. Like if you were to do a study on some well-trained bodybuilders, right? They squat sometimes, okay? They're already big. And you have them stop all leg training, but every 3 days they worked up to a 1RM on the squat. We would observe a decrease in quad hypertrophy. Their muscles get smaller, but they would probably increase their 1RM because of that highly specific training. So muscle size is a sufficient contributory cause, and we actually have some good data on this now in 2026 to increase strength. But it's one of many things that increases strength. So when we're talking about the performance of someone on the platform, and Kedric saying I can build a causative case for why cutting more might be helpful, think about, let's say those people did not cut, right? And then let's say we're just erasing the competition, having weight classes, and it was just related to good lift points, right? Now we would see a slightly lower total, and we're basically seeing the people who have the best combination of the highest muscle mass and the lowest fat mass to where they can perform well, and the best ability to recover from dropping their water weight to decrease their body mass to get better GL points, who is going to be best. So yeah, if they didn't do that cut, they would not have as high of GL points. So it is not a necessary cause to doing really well, but it's sufficient. It's contributing to all the things that they do. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the survivorship bias, if they are really not resilient to cutting at all, then that's just not on the table for them as one of those sufficient causes to enhance their performance. Does that make sense?
It does. It's difficult to tease out then, the impact necessarily, isn't it?
Yep. And that's why sports science is all about adding up a whole bunch of 1%. When you get to the highest level. Because if we were just like, hey, what are the big, and sometimes you will see sports scientists and exercise scientists or public health professionals or sports nutritionists kind of butt heads. Because if someone was like, hey, you know what, a good recommendation for protein is 1.2 grams per kilogram, because it'll enable resistance training gains, it'll decrease rates of sarcopenia and osteopenia, and it'll increase strength, all this good stuff. And it's a great population level recommendation. We know the RDA is 0.8, but if you can get 50% more than that, awesome. And then I can say to a powerlifting audience, hey, you probably want to get up to around 1.6, 1.7. And then if you're actively cutting and you're also lean, maybe we get closer to 2 grams per kilogram. And the person from the public health perspective would be like, yeah, but that makes almost no difference. And I go, well, almost everything we're talking about makes almost no difference. To you, a 600 kilo total and a 700 kilo total are both just like twice the strength level to prevent a fall. And for me, it's the difference between you are not even getting to nationals, let alone podium placings. So we're talking about where we care about a 0.0 something change to a 10-meter sprint, not can you actually run for 10 minutes without having a heart attack. So how much of a change is worthwhile and how much power we have to detect it. These are some of those fundamentally different things. So we're looking at, hey, this might be one of the things that, again, this target population, competitors at the world class level may need to consider. How can you make it so that you can have the best combination of fat mass, muscle mass, and body water, recover in time, and then perform? It seems like the elite performers at least have that figured out to a little bit better extent than the less elite performers. We're not necessarily making a straight up causal claim, but it's a relationship that makes sense. And hey, it also matches what we know anecdotally.
What about the relationship between how they felt leading into along the way, whether it's the last 2 days, and their actual performance? That I'm interested, because when I was competing, there are times when I've had smooth cuts. There are times when I had cuts where like, oh my God, there's no freaking way I'm going to be able to perform tomorrow. And then sometimes you're shocked. I can't believe it was there. And other times you have a shitty day and you're like, yeah, exactly what I thought. And I'm interested. If people listen to this, if they hear, look, if you feel horrible, you're probably fucked. The stats would show you, or if you feel horrible, some of these people actually turned it and they marked how they felt some of these people actually turned it around and had great days. So it's like, okay, well, you get a little bit of inspiration from it. And it might encourage people to start doing big cuts. I don't know. That's all up to them, right? But what did you guys find, Kedric?
So I think measuring training like performance itself is quite hard because we're across multiple weight classes. We actually look at, I asked the question, what was your training total? That was one part of my question. But the reason why like we decided not to put it in is because training totals can be inflated, right? Like if you hit 310 kilos on your squat, right? We try and you obviously hit it for multiple reps in training, right? Kilograms, right? Because I know I don't want to diminish your gains by saying you only hit 310 pounds on squat. So, but if you hit 305 in competition, is that due to your cut, or maybe you're just not squatting to that in training, right? So there's always that element. So we decided not to put that in our analysis. So I do think it's actually quite hard to ascertain what like people will say I feel bad, but I still perform well, and a lot of that is also kind of like, you know, like post hoc rationalization. Sometimes it's like, oh, I look back and I feel okay, and if that is the case, I actually had to survey lifters after their competition, after they're done. And most of the time, you will never get that follow-up because either that people are getting drug tested. Some of them, if they didn't do as well, they probably don't want to see your face for the fourth time. You know,
you perform very shitty, Eric.
I'm filling my survey right now.
Yeah. Listen, you said you felt like shit. You performed like shit. I need to get this from you. How shitty did you feel, though?
I want to do a case study on why you're so bad.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right.
The way that people feel about their performance is also like largely determined by their expectations beforehand as well, right? You know, like someone can have what is by some objective measure that, you know, we can argue about is a pretty good day, but if they thought they were going to have a fucking fantastic day, then they feel bad, even though like they actually did good. They were just like hoping, they just thought they were going to have a miracle and they didn't, and then they feel bad afterwards, right? So like that would be very hard to tease out as well.
I'd argue that's but the most common is you listen to King of the Lifts. This is what we got as athletes coming on here and we're like, I'm hitting 900 kilos. You're ranked 15th. Okay, settle down.
This is why I keep saying I don't care what you say you're going to do.
I know.
I want to see what you actually do.
Right.
Yep.
But could you, I mean, you do have you could look at their previous comps, etc., and kind of, I don't know. But anyways, what did you have a correlation though that you saw in terms of how they felt in performance? Was there any measure that you saw, or?
We actually didn't. We just used kind of like, so we actually just use like proxies or surrogates to say what actually kind of like encapsulates performance, right? So I think GLPs actually have, even though they are like sort of like dependent on one another, theoretically you would say that the higher your total goes up, right? Given the same body weight, your GLP points should be higher, right? And obviously we look at medal counts as well. So at least in our population, we can say that most people actually perform, you know, decently well, right? I think for the people that medal, right, their GLP points was more than 100, right? So I think that is decent performance. In terms of asking how they felt about their performance, we didn't ask anything about that. So it's hard for me to say, okay, cool, you know, your performance was good. And like you said, there could be like multiple ways to try to tease that out, but just for the sake of like actually making a feasible paper to publish, right? Certain things might be overly complicated. So yeah, I guess I don't really have a specific answer for you besides certain inferences that we can draw based on that. And obviously we have to also see, what previous studies looking at. And unfortunately, the thing is, I don't think that there are any powerlifting surveys out there that actually, besides the two that our group has done, right, at the world-class level, because I've been like incredibly blessed with the opportunity to go to Worlds multiple times, and you know, obviously the lifters are more than gracious to see me again and say, oh, it's you again, you know, fill out my survey, you know, which might not be the most pleasant sight, especially sometimes when you're emaciated and starving because you're cutting weight. So it's very hard for me to tease out. That's why the whole purpose of the survey was just to make it, and the reason why we used the SRSS scale amongst many scale was also because it was the fastest to fill out that's validated, right? There can be other scales with like 20 questionnaires. But if you think about it, if I have to fill 25 questions 3 times, essentially I have to do like I'm filling up 75 questions, right? I'm answering 75 questions across 3 days. That might not necessarily be the most logistically feasible, right? So the more data we put in, right, the harder it is for us to potentially get adherence, right? Especially if you're not paying them, which is usually the things that we run into sports science that can be a little bit underfunded in terms of research capacity.
Yep. And that third data point is in between when somebody weighs in and when they need to start warming up for squats as well, right? Like it's not like they're just sitting around with nothing to do, right? Like people are preparing for competition at that point, right? So, like you can't sit and grill them for an hour about every single thing that's going on.
So the third data point immediately, I don't know, because I'm in Rory at Worlds as well for this kind of stuff. I have to go into their weigh-ins, which means that some of them have to like literally wake up at 6 a.m. in the morning, like stand at the weigh-ins, and as they come out, I'll say, okay, cool, I'm here to fill up your survey. Get you to fill up your survey, but I know you need to rehydrate first, right? Get whatever you need to do in the first 10 minutes. I'll be here, right? Once you're done, fill up this survey, and then all the best for your competition, and then I'm gone. I'm out of their face, you know? I'm not going to be like there. Yeah. So that is basically how I was doing the third, like day zero, the data collection for day zero.
Do you know though, even those with high GL points, or you said you've seen who had collected medals, did they have indications like in their last 2 days feel like shit, feel horrible, and yet they walked away with a medal or high GL points? Or was there a correlation, feel great in the last 2 days? Like, were they trending higher in how they felt in the last 2 days and performed higher, despite the fact that earlier you said people cutting more had higher GL points, which is interesting. The feeling and the cutting and the GL points, I'm trying to throw those together for myself.
So on the individual basis, it's hard to say, because obviously when we are looking at statistical relationship, we need an adequate enough sample size, right? So we are collecting a bunch of data points and then say, okay, cool, we have X amount of people. This is the result that came from it. But on general, we did see that most of the lifters, right, actually felt worse on day 2 relative to day 0, right? So on day 2, right before weigh-in, they actually felt the worst when they're cutting weight, right? On 4 measures, right? Yeah, and the reason why we actually say that is, like, if you look at emotional balance and mental capacity, right, it could possibly be like, okay, cool, you know, I know my weight is heavy, right? Because if you look at the relationship, day 7, you only lose like 0.4, right? And then from day 2 to day 0, you lose like 1.5 or something like that, which means that at day 2, you are possibly the heaviest, which means that there are certain levels of like stress right, going into it, right? It could also probably be some people are still training, right? And that's another limitation that we said. We didn't really ask how do you taper. We didn't control for like when was your last training session. Some people train 1 day out, some people train 2 days out, some people train 3 days out. So some people might actually still feel a little bit like fatigued from their taper session. So these are things that we couldn't control. So we're just asking general questions. And you know, once you make weight, right, and then you know you made it, you know, you just feel that sense of like, okay, cool, I've actually made it, right? And when you look at if we contrast that with combat sports, and people actually do like in-depth interviews, people actually say that making weight is winning like half of the battle for combat sports. You know, that's why they actually see that weight cutting is essential. Like weight cutting is kind of like inbuilt into combat sports because it's like their identity, because it's part of the battle that they need to win, right? And I'm not saying that is exactly the same with powerlifting, but if you think about it, it's like if you think you made weight and you already won half the battle, potentially your mood is like slightly elevated, right? So we actually saw day 2 being the you know, kind of like the most stressful, or at least four of the skills, and those categories are mental state, overall recovery, emotional balance, and physical states. So these are the 4 things that we measured where people they are less likely. So I'm not saying that they felt like that. They are less likely to report it higher compared to lower. So the likelihood is roughly 45 to 65%, right? So it's not like 1,000 times more, right? So the likelihood is large enough to be detected, but it's not like exponentially where someone who doesn't cut weight would feel 1,000 times better, 1,000 times more likely to report all these skills to be slightly better, right? So those are just certain things that we have to make clear, right? We're looking at the odds of someone reporting that these 4 categories are probably lower on day 2 compared to day 0. So that is the comparison, right? It's not saying that in a vacuum, everything is supposed to be good, and now you're feeling crap, right? So there's comparison, and there's also like odds or likelihood where this might be lower.
So if I understood that properly, Kedric, it is relatively normal and not a cause for concern if like a couple of days out from your competition, if you're feeling a little bit rough, whether or not you're cutting weight, or regardless of like how big that cut is, you may be feeling a little bit rough. It's not the end of the world, and you shouldn't panic. Is that kind of what I understood there? Or maybe I editorialized with the you shouldn't panic, but maybe you can panic if you like. But that is a relatively normal thing to be experiencing at that point, and is sort of part of the process.
Well,
Yeah,
let me ask this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, let me ask this. So did that answer the question? And Eric, also, you can jump in as well.
Sure.
Did you see the shit of you? Is there any kind of like, if you feel like worse, you performed worse, or was there some people who felt horrible but performed well and medaled? Is there some people like it? What did we see something like that? What did we see in terms of that?
Kedric, feel free.
No, Eric,
I can jump in after if you got anything where you want to
can
put
go
that.
ahead, then I'll add on to what.
I think it's kind of interesting that we are now starting to get into what I would say would be the natural evolution of Kedric's research, which would be looking at the weight regain process, right? So what do you do after you make weight? And then obviously there will be some threshold for feeling terrible where in a 2-hour weigh-in competition, there's not enough time to recover. But a big variable that is going to be impacting, if you think about it, like, is my shittiness as a metric going to predict my performance, is not just the time point at when you were, in our study at the pre-cut period, or even reflecting back on it. It's going to be what were you able to do to recover from the weight cut. And there's going to be a relationship between how much you cut and where you can get to. But I think it's actually quite interesting. I have a PhD student who Kedric is an advisor for, who is now looking at this specific question. His name is Chao-Ke Hu, and he's a powerlifting coach from China. He's here, and he's going to be doing a whole lot of research specifically looking at different ways of trying to rapidly recover from whatever you did to make weight. And, this is something, there's a very obvious difference in performance in a 24-hour versus 2-hour federation, right? You can just talk to some of the guys in the untested comps, and the amount of shittiness that they feel and can sustain because they have more time to recover, way more. And the times when you have had people who have absolutely killed themselves to make weight, pretty reliably it doesn't go well on the platform, or they have to do something. They might have to drop their opener. So I'm actually really interested, and I'm not answering the question directly, but I'm telling you about cool future research. Could be actually going out to competitions and then weighing people after they've made weight. So having them step on a scale right before their first squat. And, we could get like a correction factor for, you know what I'm saying? Like we could weigh their shoes, their belt, their singlet, and, kind of get like a number. We could even, ask them, hey, can we weigh all your stuff afterwards? Or we could get a correction factor so we can quickly do it at a study. And now you can start to look at the relationship between performance, their actual registered total, their peak total that they had in training, their training body weight, which they will typically have registered if they are, actually going through the weight cutting process, their weigh-in, and then their immediately prior to the platform body weight. And then you can look at how often did people have to lower their squat opener or bench opener, deadlift opener, whatever you're interested in. But squat opener is probably the most sensitive because it's closest to the weigh-in and recovery time period relative to those other things. And now we can start to tease out what's going on, because you can talk to Kedric. He, I think rightfully so, really emphasizes liquid consumption and liquid consumption of carbohydrates compared to, say, getting a meal in. But you could make a mechanistic argument based upon some of the data on, say, hunger or perception or the nocebo effect of having a pre-workout meal, although it's mostly been shown to have an impact on your ability to perform total repetitions or volume in a workout rather than acute strength. There's a lot of things going on. So what you do in those 2-hour period could be critical. And it is, I'm unsure. I have like a mixed hypotheses. Does it matter more if you're doing a 24-hour weigh-in, or does it matter more if you're doing a 2-hour? Because you have less time to recover, but also there's a certain threshold of weight you just won't cut, so it may not make as much of a difference. Anyway, so I think there's a lot more to research here, where we're looking at not just what did you do to make weight and how did that predict performance, but then what did you do to recover from that making of weight to then perform well.
I just want to add one thing to that, Eric, is that when people have a 24-hour weigh-in, there are also methods that they are allowed to use that you are not allowed to use for a 2-hour weigh-in, which
IV, yep.
I don't have personal experience with, but seem like they would make a significant difference.
Absolutely, they do. And if you look at some of the combat sport athlete literature,
Because they are allowed to use those methods, aren't they?
Depends. It depends on the point of sport, right? And whether it's WADA governed or it's the individual federation. And it also has a massive impact depending upon the type of performance. So you will see that weight regain more reliably predicts improved performance in mixed martial artists, wrestlers, judo athletes than it does boxers and striking athletes.
Really?
Because when you think about it, weighing more and actually throwing someone onto the ground and sitting on top of them before punching them in the face, or just sitting on top of them and getting points if it's wrestling or something like that, is going to be more directly impacted by your total mass. But if we're talking about, you being a boxer, you need to make the weight cutoff and you need to recover, because you need to have the endurance to get through the rounds. But whether you're scoring points, it's about your arm reach, and sure, weighing more is going to help a little bit. But within the same weight class, the biggest predictors of punching power is not just going to be your body mass, right? So striking sports are less reliably benefited from a lot of weight regain. But if you're throwing somebody around, then it's pretty clear, So it really does depend on a lot of factors. So, I think one cool thing that you also need to look at is, just because you can put the weight back on, is that weight in the right spot? And what we're talking about here is water weight. So how long does it take for water to move from your digestive tract into your body? And then how long does it take to move from the extracellular to the intracellular space? So we can potentially look at things like bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy, urine specific gravity, because like you could drink 4 gallons of water right now, and then before you split, died, and had hyponatremia, you'd weigh a whole lot more, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have recompositioned or gotten back to a homeostatic level of water balance and having it where you need it. And there's many instances where you can rehydrate an athlete, but they don't start feeling good until bench or deadlift. And modifying that approach sometimes can make a substantial difference. And if they do something crazy like down way too much fluids, or if there's too much carbohydrate in those fluids initially, it actually can slow down the absorption of not only the carbohydrate, but also the fluids. And if you look at endurance sport, they have specifically figured out how much glucose can my digestive tract take on board in a given time window, because the limitation for high intensity endurance sport, like triathletes, marathons, sometimes is glycogen availability. So if they can provide fuel while they're going, that blood glucose availability is going to offset the needs of glycogen, and then they can start to replenish some glycogen during the race. But if you try to push it too far and you are oversaturating the GI tract with the amount of carbohydrates that it can take in, now you cause GI distress. You might have diarrhea, you might vomit, and performance is going to go down. So there's research on maybe we need to deliver different forms of carbohydrate to take up different enzymes to get that through, like a mixture of fructose and glucose, because we're trying to maximize this. That's the bottleneck. But glycogen and glucose availability aren't the main factors in powerlifting. So when someone doesn't really understand that and they just want to get food in because they've been starving, or they think that, I'm carb depleted, I really got to focus on that, because they're misinformed as to what are the determinants of strength performance. And it really is just, I need to rehydrate primarily. They can make certain decisions which slow down the rehydration process, but help something that probably won't have as much of an impact on performance. So yeah, there's a lot to consider here. Electrolytes, carbohydrates, the fluids themselves, solid food, comfort, psychology, and GI distress, and the timeline. I mean, another thing to consider, it's like we say a quote unquote 2-hour weigh-in, but what if your lot number means you're the very last person to get weighed, or you're 0.1 over, and now you go to the end of the line? It ain't 2 hours before you're doing your first squat. It's more like an hour and 10 minutes, especially if you're one of the people with a lower squat in the flight. If you're the strongest squatter in the flight, you actually have a slight advantage. Now you've got, number of minutes plus a little bit times people in your flight before your opener. So
yeah, we say 2 hours, but it could actually be as little as 30 minutes if you cut it very fine on both ends, right? Which is not, for many people, it's not even enough time to warm up to squat.
A couple of these things that's interesting is, so people could actually tank it by the water load process. And could you drink too much water ahead of time thinking I need to load up to instigate myself to pee, etc., and actually tank your performance, overdoing it with the water load process?
Go for it, Kedric.
So are you mentioning this like during the loading, right? During the cutting process?
Yeah, before the weigh-in. Before the weigh-in, thinking I'm going to instigate myself to pee. I'm going to start. So I'm drinking tons. We have the water load process. Can you actually overdo it? Is there a point where it's too much? You think there's not too much. I'm going to be peeing like crazy. I'm going to be thankful the last 2 days or a day when I'm not drinking at all. But it's like, no, you definitely can upset yourself.
Yeah. So I'll send this kind of like thought as well, where we look at, when we look at the research of how kind of like how much weight lifters lose, right? Usually around 3 to 4%. I think that when we look at the average weight for these lifters, they tend to fall somewhere around like the mean, where most people are around that that 74 to 93 range, because that's generally where most the largest population size is. There isn't really much data on this, and to back this up, but I don't think that it scales linearly with weight classes, because if you think about it, right, and you say, okay, cool, like 5% for someone who is 100 kilos is 5 kilos, right? But we know like the largest, the heaviest you can be is 120 kilos, because that's like, after that is like, the unlimited weight. So another 5% for 120 is 6 kilos, right? So that's a lot, right? But the fact of the matter is that if we look at certain things where what regulates water, right? The main thing is our kidneys, right? So just because someone is 120 kilos doesn't necessarily mean that someone's kidneys are like linearly bigger than someone who is, like 100 kilos, which means that the way they filter water would be quicker and the way they expel water would be more. So I think that there will be a point where all this organ function is actually the limiting factor. And it's just kind of like I said, it's also selection bias, because we don't actually have the data points to actually say that, oh, this is the case, because once again, most lifters that we like, it is likely that I will get a whole bunch of lifters that cut in the lower weight classes rather than higher, right? So if I want to say, oh, does it scale linearly if someone who's 140 kilos? It's probably likely that the 140 kilo lifter is not cutting weight, right? So I actually don't know. Like there's that gap there. So this is just to say, first of all, I don't think it scales linearly, which means that I think that there's a limit, because prescription of what fluid intake usually goes by like body weight. So usually people go with 1 liter per every 10 kilos, right? So if someone is 120 kilos, they need to drink 12 liters of fluid, right? According to that. And it's actually a lot, right? And if we look at maximum rate of like water absorption at one go, before you kind of like go into a state of potential water poisoning, the maximum rate of fluid absorption for most people is actually 800 mils to 1 liter per hour. So if you have to drink 12 liters of fluids per day, it means that you have to be awake for at least 12 hours, drinking 1 liter per hour, right? That is quite, it's not really feasible for most people. And, unfortunately, that is what the research currently uses, right? But when I look a little bit deeper into the actual sort of like relative, the relative amount they drink, meaning that how much they actually drink in relation to their habitual intake. So what the research did was that we gave X amount of water to these people, right? And then we actually look at what their baseline intake is, right? Because you have to look at the baseline. And what we found was that even after the prescription based on body weight, it's roughly 2.5 times more than what they usually drink, right? Because so let's just say if a 120 kilo lifter only drinks 2 liters of water a day, 2.5 times more is just 5 liters instead of 12 liters, which is more than double that what they should drink, right? So I would say that that absolutely is an upper limit, because to think that we can drink more fluids, right, to trick our body, where the kidney, like with all this water loading stuff, right, it is a sport related intervention, and our body doesn't function like our body, like our organs doesn't function. It's like, okay, I'm going to sports mode now. The more water you drink, right, you expel more because of your sport.
Mine do.
Our kidneys function for a certain reason is basically to keep us alive, right? So there's a reason why. I mean, if you try to chuck 4 liters down in one go, and if you manage to do it, you probably faint, because your salts would be so diluted, all the electrolytes in your body would be so diluted, you would just faint. And water poisoning is a thing,
Yep.
So
Yeah.
I think that
just
that absolutely
to kind of
is upper limit.
Yeah. And just to back up what Kedric says, I think it makes a lot of sense physiologically to have a water loading protocol that is scaled to your habitual intake, because water balance is so tightly regulated. You could be someone who habitually drinks, let's say 5 liters of water per day. And if you drop down to 2, you would be uncomfortable for a while, and you would be, probably clinically dehydrated by a little bit, and it wouldn't be ideal, but you could survive on that in perpetuity, as long as you weren't like in a hot environment and sweating. And you would just pee less, and your urine would be more concentrated and more yellow, and your body would do everything it could to retain more fluids, right? And you would see an initial drop in body weight, and then it would come back up a little bit. Because you would see your urination frequency, volume, and concentration decrease. I don't recommend this, but the point is that when you look at people, like when people ask for hydration guidelines and they go, well, how much volume of water should I drink? It often it's not the best way to prescribe it. So, for example, if you look at the third edition of my books, I suggest people to look at their urine color, because that kind of scales to auto-regulating, right? There's a really interesting like variance where you could take 2 people who live in the same climate and have similar protocols of training, same body weight, same sex, similar body composition, but they could have like a 50%, 70% difference in their habitual fluid intake. So, and that's just down to things like sweat rate and other salt sensitivity. You'll see genetic differences in how people are impacted by sodium intake and how long it takes them to get back to baseline. And there's, genetic things that are related to that. Some people are more likely to have cardiovascular disease risk and a higher blood pressure if they have a higher salt intake. And some people not as much, even though reducing sodium at the population level would probably reduce overall rates of cardiovascular disease. So anyway, that's just to point out that it's not just how much do I weigh and how much do I sweat, and then the fact is that most people don't have all those things lined up. You might train in a temperature controlled gym. They might train in Sweden, and they might train in an untemperature controlled gym in Houston. So the amount of sweat that they're going through, right, on top of those genetic differences, even if you're the same weight class, is why you don't just copy the protocol of some other 93. So you kind of have to, as a nutritionist or dietitian or just a coach in general, you need to get them to start tracking their habitual fluid intake, and knowing that even just asking them to track their fluid intake will modify their fluid intake, but that's okay because it's a highly adaptive system. Right. So, like I said, you could cut your water intake in half, and although it probably wouldn't be a good idea for most people, you won't die. And then from there, you would execute a water loading protocol. And you need to know if you're the individual person you're working with, this has a habitually really, really high fluid intake. And sometimes this happens when someone's dieting. Like the one thing you can definitely have and not even worry about the caffeine is like a whole lot of Sprite Zero, and you get someone who's hungry and dieting, and the amount of sugar-free gum and Sprite Zero that they're drinking can push their fluid intakes really high sometimes, and surprisingly. And we also get fluid from our food, so fruits and vegetables are 80, 90% water in most cases, which is one of the useful reasons of why they fill you up. And that contributes to your hydration as well. So when you do something like a gut cut and you cut out your fruits and vegetables, you are actually doing a little bit of a water cut and you don't even realize it. So there's a lot of variables at play here that people don't necessarily consider. Like there are some animals who get almost the entirety of their hydration needs accomplished through their diet and drink very little water. These are animals that are adapted to live in like arid or desert conditions. So we're obviously not that, but that can vary based upon where you're from. Like if you talk to Kedric about how cold New Zealand is, and you talk to my other student, my PhD candidate, who's going to be coming on later, Christian, who's from Denmark, about how cold New Zealand is, and we're in the North Island, it's not that cold, they're going to give you a very different response, right? So based upon what they're habituated to and their ethnic background.
Yeah, it's I guarantee you people are hitting up other. I'm an 83. Let me ask another 83. I'm a 93. And it's literally just as simplified as that. Here it is. Yep. He's a 93. He's roughly your build. This is his water cutting protocol. And I guarantee you there are coaches that they give, all right, here's what I do based off of your size is probably roughly around here. And they give you a water cutting protocol with none of these variables that you talk to. The difference between going to your powerlifting coach and they've dealt with a lot of powerlifting athletes and them walking them through it, and going to, let's say, a doctor like yourself, Eric, or Kedric, and you guys walking them through it is night and day. Absolutely night and day, let alone someone doing their own.
Fake doctors.
Fake doctors, thank you.
Yeah.
Or
like, you don't want to have a heart attack around either one of us. You're going to be like, what's the RPE of your heart attack?
That's right.
10. And Kedric will come in, no, I got this.
Kedric's like, I need you to be clear with me. How shitty do you feel right now? On a scale of 1 to 5. And then I go 5. You go, that's fucking bad. That's Kedric's diagnosis. That's fucking bad, dude. You're probably going to.
We tried to help him, but he died before we could get the RPE rating or the SRSS.
That's right.
We only got the first data point, and so I don't really know what the trend was here.
I don't know what to work with.
I'm not sure that the heart attack caused his death, but at least contributed.
Yeah, you guys get all. What I could say clearly is, it's like, all right. Yep. We're losing ourselves. But yeah, no, it's true. It is interesting, and it is far more complex than people think. And that's why I'm glad you guys come on here and start laying some of this out. Because if you are a freaking coach and you're starting to go get a little over your skis here and you're starting to coach people to start to cut weight, think about it. Outsource and get other people on your team. Even if you have a referral program, please do this appropriately. You could tank someone's performance. You could do everything right with all of your training that you've given your athlete, and then you accidentally tank their performance by trying to get a little over your skis on this, like your freaking Eric Helms.
And I think more importantly is we're now talking about something that there's more of a risk than just bombing out. There's a reason why wrestling moved to 2-hour weigh-in protocol, and it was due to some highly publicized deaths of collegiate wrestlers when they had a longer weigh-in period in the 90s. And that prompted an institutional change because when athletes are given more time to cut, they will try to cut more weight. And when you cut more weight, that means greater degrees of dehydration and potential combinations with heat stress. So it's a lot rarer, because performance is the language of athletes. They're not going to typically try to cut a ridiculous amount of weight in 2 hours because they learn real quick that they can't perform and recover in that time period. But if you think about a misinformed coach who doesn't really know what they're doing, particularly bad interaction of various scenarios of someone who, potentially is not heat acclimated, travels to another location, maybe is stuck in a situation where they don't have access to food or water for a certain amount of time period, has some other clinical contraindication they're not aware of, or a medication they're on or something, you could easily see, not easily, it is not implausible that getting this wrong could risk someone's health or life long term. So I think it's just really, really important to be aware of the limitations of your scope of practice. And like this is why this type of thing becomes more and more important. Powerlifting is moving from being a professionalized sport, and we're getting, coaches and a full high performance model around someone. And I think we need to also respect the importance of athlete care and evidence-based practice, which doesn't just mean you need to have science. You don't need to have a PhD by any means. It just means that you need to value the process of incorporating what we do know about physiology and sports science and sports performance into your overall decision making. Evidence-based practice is not science-based practice. It is the experience of the clinician or coach or whomever, the needs, values, and individuality and goals and personal preferences of the athlete, as well as access to the best available research. And a lot of times there isn't much, so you have still a lot to go on if you do think about the anecdotal experiences and information that we do have out there. So it's just we are talking about cutting weight here, and we're talking about, we have juniors and we have teens. And some people really just shouldn't be trying to make weight at all. And I think that's a cautionary tale I always try to bring back is 80 to 90% of all powerlifters try to make weight. And 80 to 90% of all powerlifters should not be trying to make weight, in my opinion. The first couple of years is just compete, live a sports supportive, healthy lifestyle that is good for your performance as a human as well as the sport, see where you land, do what's best for your health. Some people come to powerlifting and they're on a journey of combating obesity. Other people, they might come from a disordered eating background where they were always trying to get smaller. Now they're, for the first time, they're trying to get bigger and they don't want to cut weight, but they might have pressure from a coach. And in both those cases, it might be inappropriate, So not everyone is kind of in this like healthy population athlete scenario, and coaches often don't know or think to ask about their history medically, psychologically, and they don't have the support personnel, even if they did ask those questions. Like every single coach, in my opinion, needs to have a sports psychologist or psychologist who has experience with weight class restricted athletes, aesthetic athletes, disordered eating patterns, and because of how common it is in our sport. And they need to have access to someone who is a legitimate care provider for musculoskeletal injuries, and also dietetics, because while Kedric and I are sports nutrition experts, we're not dietitians. We're not psychotherapists. I have published in the area of sports psychology, eating disorders as it relates to that. But you better believe that even myself, with the experience I have and the knowledge I have that's theoretical, I refer out to eating disorder specialists, registered dietitians, a doctor of physical therapy, not a chiropractor, when I have these types of concerns come up with an athlete. And if you're a coach who tries to handle all that, like, I applaud you. I know your athlete trusts you, they come to you. I've been a personal trainer coach for years. You find out when they get divorced, you find out what's going on, and you're their first port of call. But I think what you need to be is essentially the connector, and the emotional support system for them. And you need to have people that you trust, who then you can say, hey, you know what? Do you trust me as a coach? Well, I want you to trust me that I think, this person is the best person to help you. And as much as I really do want to work with you solo on this, it would be a disservice to you and dishonoring our coaching relationships. So I want to introduce you to insert expert with the right scope of practice here. So anyway, I'm done being old man daddy,
well,
overly conservative, cautious guy, but it's important.
Well, first off, I always raise an eyebrow when I hear somebody's trying to do too much and they wear all of these hats. It's like, okay, all right. People should trust you less when you're like, I got you. You only need to come to me for everything. It's like, really? Okay. Another thing I noticed, you said not chiropractor. Is that a shot, sir? Is this a whole nother episode? Are we going in?
Well, that's absolutely a shot.
Wait, are we going in? What are we doing? Should we do another 2 hours? This is supposed to be winding down the episode.
How about we save that for another time?
Let's save it. It's juicy. It's juicy.
We could do quite a lot of stuff on like who to refer to, when to refer to, who not to refer to. whether ghosts cause illnesses, like those kinds of things.
Let me ask you, does bleeding work if I feel ill? Is that still used?
Leeches. Yeah. Leeches.
That's right.
Yeah, the funny thing is leeches actually still are used in some interesting applications.
But I wouldn't
not
be surprised.
for the reason that they're not trying to remove the black bile and balance your humors necessarily. But I would just encourage people to determine what are the scopes of practices of the people you work with, and look up some consensus-based position stands from people in certain fields. And I think the most qualified person to work with musculoskeletal injuries are those with that type of scope of practice and appropriate training that is based in evidence.
Yeah, I would like to introduce an idea here that they talk about in software engineering that I think is highly applicable here. They refer to this thing called a T-shaped engineer. And what that means is, and this is going to sound very similar to coaching, if you want to be a really good software, yes, that's right. Real wide shoulders, is that there is a very large number of skills that make up a complete coaching practice. In the same way, there's a very large number of skills that make up a complete software engineering practice. Like we could sit here and we could probably come up with 30 or 40 things that you need to be good at. But the best people will usually not be an expert in all of them, but rather they'll be really, really, really deep on a small number of those things, and know a little bit about all of them. And so for something like a powerlifting coach, the coach probably should know a very large amount about programming and biomechanics, say, and then a little bit about sports psychology and a little bit about nutrition and a little bit about, I don't know what else, weight cutting, say. And then when they start getting out of their depth in one of those areas, and you need to know enough to know where your depth actually is, then you go, hey, look, I probably am not the right person for this. Here is a person to refer you to instead. And then similarly, presumably most good sports nutritionists will be very, very deep on nutrition, weight cutting, maybe psychology around food. And then they know a little bit about training, and they know a little bit about periodization, and they know a little bit about sports psychology as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. 100% agree.
And that's the high performance model you see in any high performing number of medals per capita centralized system. So for example, if you look at the UK's model of sport performance, if you look at high performance sport in New Zealand, if you look at, the States is a little less centralized, but this does happen if you are someone who taps into their national training center and you're out in Colorado, you will see you have the sports coach, and then they are supported by basically a pit crew around them. You have a performance psychologist, sports psychologist. You have sports monitoring, a sports scientist. And when I say sports scientist, people kind of think the sports science field, like myself or Kedric. But I mean someone who is actually using technology, monitoring, and statistical analysis for the individual to figure out what things can I monitor for them and what predicts performance. And then how do I look at this stuff over time? And then you have potentially, obviously not in powerlifting, it's not appropriate, but a strength and conditioning coach who would do the training side of it. Our training is our competition, so that's kind of the same hat. And then of course you'd have your injury specialist team, your sports medicine doctor, your athletic trainer, ATC in the States sometimes, or a sports focused physical therapist or physiotherapist in other parts of the world. It would be ludicrous for certain Olympic sports and codes for not to use that model. That's been what has resulted in the best sport performance outcomes, even though sometimes in the fitness industry, you'll get people who are very kind of anti-establishment, I've got all the answers kind of guru mentality. And apparently for some reason that's fine for someone in fitness, but they'll accept that that's not the way, an elite track and field strength or endurance or team sport athlete operates. That's of course that's the way you do it, because we see those are the country's teams or individuals who perform the best.
I remember Taylor Atwood came on here, and this is exactly what he said. He's like, people would make fun of me. How many people you got on your team? You got half a dozen people on your team. This is crazy. And he's like, no, it's not. That's what I see around me when I look at these top end athletes that I aspire to be like in these other sports. I think it's crazy that you have one guy, one girl, one whatever, or two or whatever. Yes, I have specialists that I call upon depending on the needs of this prep. I don't know why this is so nuts. But anyways, but I digress. And now I think it's far more common. The more conversations we have like this, I think people will be incredibly humble to come on here, sit on a podcast like this, and they're like, yeah, I do all my clients' nutrition and I do their weight cut. And if you two doctors started asking them some of these questions and they'd be exactly that face.
and just to show you how much
out of depth.
It's not just about knowledge either. It's also that I think there's a lot of self-coach lifters, and I think that's awesome. And I do like to program for myself, but I have always had a coach in every time I've competed, whether it was Olympic weightlifting, strongman, bodybuilding, you name it, because it's not just about knowing things. It is coaching as a relationship. It's an interrelational dynamic. And it's also about having someone who could be objective when you're in your own head. And you can't study your way out of being human. And you can only, to a certain degree, experience your way out of the same mistakes. You can really benefit from the collaborative process and get out of your own way. And even if you know how and what's coming and there's stress involved that you can manage, you're also still managing that stress. And having a coach who can work collaboratively with you to do that for you it's like that's why science is not coaching. And I think that's another thing that people sometimes get wrong, because if we said, okay, having the best up-to-date evidence makes you a good coach, then that means every coach from 20 years ago was a moron.
Yeah,
that's not the case. They were operating on the best information that they had, hopefully, at that time. But coaching is a skill. Coaching is a relationship, and you are that first port of call where then you have this team around that person. Because I have multiple skills. Yeah. Like, for example, when I've worked with my athletes, I have been their emotional support, and I also do their programming, and I can also do their nutrition. But that's just because I'm a crazy person who's obsessively studied this, and that's the only thing I care about and do in my life. Like, I can't ride a bike, I can't drive stick, but I can do all of this, and I still
feel a little better
refer
now.
out
Thank
to
you.
Yeah, no, I've see when you
keep going
when
with
you
what you can't do
leverage on one thing, there's an opportunity cost. I still have the same number of hours in a day as everyone else. So if I spend all of it on lifting related sports and sports science, there's going to be gaps in my human abilities, right?
I'm going to use that next time someone calls me out. I'm like, look, there's opportunity cost, but have you fucking seen the shape I'm in right now? I'm like, now I will admit I've done some harsh cutting on that budget, but there was opportunity cost, and I made my fucking bed and I'm lying in it. And I'll see you come summer.
I can commentate any competition.
That's right.
But I am completely devoid of any ability to interact with humans.
I'm talking to my boss, by the way, at work. But anyways, I digress.
Boss, you're like, it's a third attempt on this budget proposal. He's looking good. Boss, like, I'm right here. Yeah.
But ask me all Russell or he 2019. I'll tell you his fucking PR, and I'll tell you how I felt about it too. Get that smug look off your face. But you make me. There's one person that came to mind when we were talking about self-coaching. My God, if somebody could kidnap Penna and force him, you're going to do this programming from this coach, I wonder what might happen. He might be the highest level athlete, 2-time world champion, 2-time at Sheffield, Euros, blah, blah, blah. And he's self-coached and still. And I always wonder, because he's such a passionate guy, if he had a coach that's like, no, you don't go off program. You don't this, that, the other. Let's see what happens. I'm interested.
Well, I'll just put this out there too, that there's formal coaching relationships, and there's also people who do take advice and learn. And I think Penna is someone who is very open to new information, and has evolved his think. Like he has sought out education, and he values education from others. Like, he's reached out to me and asked me questions. But I think there's also, you can have that, but also want to have a certain level of control, so that you're not necessarily just, I got this from a place of ego. It is more of a personality thing, where it's like, I will seek out that information and learn, and I'm going to push myself to progress, but I want to filter it through my own control. And I think an athlete just needs to have a level of awareness to diagnose, or at least be honest with themselves, to when that actually starts to become a barrier, right? Because some athletes can filter that and still make good decisions. Other athletes, they'll get the information, but they struggle to actually implement it, or it takes much longer, or they get emotionally stressed and they know they should do better, but they don't. And sometimes having that accountability can be there. So I think it's just important to acknowledge, like, necessarily hiring and having a formal coach and announcing on your Instagram, be like, I'm coached by, is not the only way this can occur. You can have people in your corner who aren't necessarily your coach, you know?
And when it does happen, it exists on a spectrum between like complete command and control, where the coach says do this and the athlete does that without any questioning. The very far end is that the athlete completely self-coaches. But then in between, you have various versions of like collaborative coaching relationships where the coach suggests things and the athlete suggests things and you mush them together, or the athlete writes the program and the coach comes in and says, hey, how about you do this thing differently? Or they don't make any changes and they just hold the athlete accountable to the program that the athlete wrote, right? Like there's dozens of ways that you could set up that relationship, which don't have to be coach says jump and you say, okay, how high? Right? Like there's a thousand ways of doing that.
This is what I think somebody's got to talk Penna into in the introductory of, we're not talking, hey, listen to me.
Why are we going so hard on Penna?
No, Eric, this is personal now. That's why. Okay.
Buried in the last 2 hours of the conversation.
We say, we're going to go into chiropractor in a second. I'm joking. But we say, listen, it's collaborative. Write your program. Let me view it. Let me ask a couple questions about it. And then you send me videos. I'm going to hold you accountable. And then if I call audibles from what I saw from videos, you stick to it and we collaborate on where you end up on the audible. That's it. You write your own program, the whole nine. I'll change nothing. I'm going to hold you accountable and ask for audibles if I see fluctuations of difficulty, etc. And I'm going to ask questions. That's all. And maybe you're asking yourself the questions. When you hear come from me, it's going to hit different. That's all. How about that? How about we start there? There it is. Clip it. Send it to fucking Penna. The guy's going to be a world champ again.
It's actually funny when we mentioned Penna, because I've actually
started coaching him.
A short stint with Penna for nutrition back in 2021. So we actually, Penna is famous or infamous for doing large cuts, right? So we actually worked together in 2021 for a brief moment. So and then after that, he either realized, okay, cool, Kedric has served the purpose I want. Maybe he gave me more insight into how I can cut, or potentially that, I think it's better that I cut my, I don't need a coach, because whatever Kedric tells me is essentially what I already do. And I actually understand my body better because I've done these cuts so many times. So there's also that element as well, right? And I think, Ryan, you bring up a very important point where you talk about, okay, this is what I do. Let's look at certain like questions. And when I do cuts with people for the first time, that is the first question I ask: how do you previously perform weight cuts, and what was it like, right? Because if they have made weight in the past, it means that there is some element that was successful. And when they come to you, what they're trying to do is they're trying to fill the gap, or at least the perceived gap that right now I might have made weight. It could have went horribly, right? And I'm trying to improve that, or I could have made weight, but I think I can do better. So we as coaches, we have to identify the gap. And for that to happen, we actually have to question first, what have you done in the past, right? Because I don't want to just overhaul everything. Something that's very interesting is, I work with, and it goes back to the previous example of water loading that you asked, where we look at, for example, Elliot Sykes, right? So I do Elliot's nutrition, right? And back in the day, Elliot didn't cut weight because he was really, really light as a 74, right? Underweight. And right now he has put on some muscle. And in the past, what we have done was, like, when we first started, because he has no experience cutting weight. So when someone doesn't have experience cutting weight, I just give them sort of like a general recommendation that applied largely to most people, and ideally backed up by some form of scientific evidence. So I did start Elliot with the typical 1 liter per 10 kilo body weight. So Elliot being 74, right, he'll drink roughly 7.5 liters, right? But for the recent cuts, we found out that Elliot only drinks like 1.5 to 2 liters of fluids a day. And I said, okay, cool, there's also a calculus, right, where I'm not sure if he will lose as much weight. But the fact of the matter is that he also weighed in like he is lighter than usual. So even prior to weight, he's like 75. So even if he doesn't lose as much weight, right, he probably still make weight. So I took the small risk and said, okay, instead of drinking 7.5 liters, let's just put it to around 5 liters, right? So if you drink 2 liters a day, your top end, 2.5 times more is 5 liters. And Elliot basically lost the same way with the water loading protocol, which means that, that for him, at least in this case, slightly less fluid allowed him to lose the same amount of weight, which is, and people might ask you, if you get the same outcome, why don't you just play it safe? Because drinking a lot of water throughout the day is actually not actually the easiest thing. Not to mention that amongst many other things that you might think about, right? You have to track as well, right? So you need to calculate the amount of fluids that you drink, right? So if I can actually reduce the stress for a lifter or the amount of effort the lifter needs to put in and get the same outcome, that is a big win, right? So I do think that in that sense, right, trying to find out where the lifter was and then try to make certain changes is going to be important. That is where the sort of like the practical element of coaching comes from. I think that more often than not, a lot of like people, we don't assess the baseline, right? We always, I think if you look at when we do surveys as well, when we ask like combat sports, combat athletes or powerlifters where your information come from, usually it comes from a friend or online. This is the most common, like when people fill up surveys, they get their information for the most from this, right? And now in the podcast world as well, including this, right? People get information from podcasts, right? And people will say, oh, you should do this, you should do that, you should do this, right? But the fact of the matter is that I think when it comes to a 2-hour weigh-in, other than what it has been discussed or what the protocols are there that we have shared or whatever is in the scientific literature, there's really as much things that you can do that might be helpful within that 2-hour time frame as for a 2-hour cut, right? Just because that time frame is so narrow. I'm not saying that we possess all the elite knowledge, because what I'm literally saying is that I don't possess any special knowledge more than what is already out there, and the rest of it we don't really know, because like I said, for example, Eric mentioned one of the PhD students, Chowker, who will be doing more specific studies into rehydration protocols. Right now, we actually don't really know whether there's a specific rehydration protocol that works better or not, right? So we actually don't know what is the case. In fact, for a matter that I mentioned, catering different water loading protocols to individuals, some consuming less, some consuming more, whether it actually does make a difference, we actually don't know in terms of the scientific literature, right? This is through personal coaching experience. So there's a lot of things that we actually don't know. What I'm saying is that, if someone tells you that, oh, you should probably take this and that and this so that you can improve your cutting or your rehydration process, you should probably be a little bit more skeptical, especially if it's within a 2-hour weigh-in. Sometimes doing less is actually more, because doing so much within a 2-hour weigh-in, you might just be like, cool. The next thing I know, I have to go to the bathroom to take a huge crap because my body literally can't process anything in 2 hours. Or if they have the mindset that if I take something, it will make my cutting process easier, people will be like, now I can do a harder cut because XYZ that I take would make my cut easier. Therefore, I can increase the difficulty and cut more. But then in the end, you just mess things up, right? So I do think that a lot of this is, the experience really matters. But then you also have to evaluate that, because elite levels are such different, like on a different level. My experience is not evidence for you, right? My experience is my personal experience. I can probably share with you what works and what not, but there's a likelihood that what works for me may not necessarily work for you. And in fact, what you are telling me is you're telling me that what worked for you, but you're not telling me what didn't work for you, because most people will not like to share about what didn't work, right? They like to share if they do well, they say that I did well because of XYZ, therefore this must work, right? It's kind of also like a survivorship bias. We are only talking about this person doing well because this person has survived the ordeal. It's like the plane that went through, and then they said, oh, like the typical analogy where they talk about survivorship bias. We talk about this person's performance because they did well. But on the flip side, if the person didn't do well and did the same exact cutting protocol, we will not be talking about the cutting protocol at all, because the person actually didn't do well, and we are not mentioning that whatsoever. So I think that it's very important to consider that, because like I said, going back to the 2-hour weigh-in things, less is more usually. And that also means that if you have to cut less weight, it's probably going to be more for your performance as well, right? So there's like a general macro theme as well. For 2-hour weigh-ins, less is usually more for as a general like heuristic principle.
I think that's a perfect way to summarize and wrap this up. The key takeaway is less is more. Don't try to do too much. Gentlemen, we got a lot of meat on the bone to cover for another one of these. It's got to be said. Let's get back together relatively quickly. I appreciate you guys. You guys are phenomenal. You make me look good. You're always welcome back. We'll jump back in the group chats. Everybody listening, as per usual, please do subscribe, give us high ratings, and until next time, 6-pack Lapadat, 6 up, and we are out.